Rain hammered the windshield so hard that the wipers were barely keeping up, just smearing water back and forth across the glass. I slowed down to 20 miles an hour. Visibility was almost zero. To my right stretched the dark, unbroken wall of a Carolina forest. Suddenly the CB radio hissed and spat out a short, ragged breath. I reached for the mic to turn the volume down, and at that exact moment I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Outside the passenger window. In that blind zone where the headlights can't reach. A face was pressed against the wet glass. Pale. Distorted. Mouth open. The eyes were staring directly at me. The problem was that I was driving 20 miles per hour, and the cab of my semi sits nearly 10 feet off the ground. And that face wasn't falling behind by even an inch. These are 3 true scary stories about mile 13. I've been a truck driver for 20 years. In that time I've crossed this country back and forth more times than I can count. I've seen wrecks, slept in abandoned rest stops, and gotten used to the kind of loneliness only the highway can give you. Interstate 80 in Wyoming during the winter is the kind of place where mistakes aren't forgiven. The wind out there can blow empty trailers straight into the ditch, and the snowstorms come on so suddenly you don't even realize what's happening until you're trapped inside a white tunnel. It was late November. I was hauling a load of lumber from Omaha to Salt Lake City. My Peterbilt hummed steadily beneath me. The heater was blasting. The cab smelled like old coffee and diesel. Outside, there was nothing but blackness. Only the twin beams of my headlights cut through the darkness, catching the snowflakes flying toward me. The highway was completely empty. No trucks ahead. No headlights behind me. Just me, the low drone of the engine, and the white lane markings sliding under the hood. I passed the sign for mile 13. Out there in Wyoming, that stretch isn't remarkable for anything except a long, slow uphill grade that seems to go on forever. About 2 miles past the sign I noticed a dark shape on the shoulder. As I got closer, my headlights picked out an old, rusted Ford Bronco. It was parked crooked, the right side wheels sunk deep into the snow. No headlights. No hazard lights. I eased off the throttle and glanced at my mirrors. No one around. By the unwritten rules of the trucking brotherhood, when you see a stranded vehicle in weather like that, you at least call it out on the CB. I grabbed the microphone and switched to channel 19. Anyone westbound on I-80 past mile 13, there's an old Ford on the shoulder. Might need assistance. Only the steady hiss of static answered me. I drove past. For a second, through the Bronco's window, I thought I saw a dark silhouette sitting in the driver's seat. But at 60 miles an hour in a snowstorm, your eyes can play tricks on you. I set the mic back down and took a sip of lukewarm coffee. 20 minutes passed. The snowstorm intensified. I focused on the road, feeling the trailer tires occasionally slide on patches of black ice. Then I saw another dark shape ahead. I blinked, thinking it was fatigue. But the shape slowly took form. I tapped the brakes, hearing the air system sigh heavily. On the shoulder sat an old, rusted Ford Bronco. Right wheels buried deep in the snow. My brain immediately tried to find a logical explanation. Another vehicle. Same model. Just coincidence. Wyoming is full of old trucks. But as I drove past, my headlights slid across the rear bumper. A sticker hung there. A faded yellow smiley face with half of it torn away. I had seen that exact sticker 20 minutes earlier. A chill crawled down my spine. It was the same vehicle. But how could it have passed me if I never once saw headlights in my mirrors? I had been driving 60 miles an hour. For that Bronco to overtake me unnoticed, it would have had to drive off-road, in total darkness, without lights. The CB radio suddenly clicked. The static changed into a dull, rhythmic sound. Like someone slowly dragging a fingernail across the microphone. Scratch. 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 I reached over and shut the radio off completely. The cab became too quiet. Only the engine and the wind. I checked the rearview mirror. The highway behind me was empty. I convinced myself I must have fallen asleep for a split second with my eyes open. It happened sometimes. Micro-sleep. I must have imagined the whole thing. I drove another 30 miles. By then the storm had turned into a wall of white noise. I could barely see the hood of my own truck. I needed to find a place to stop. According to the GPS, the nearest truck stop was about 10 miles ahead. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. My back ached from tension. Then the engine coughed. The RPMs dropped for a moment before stabilizing again. I glanced at the gauges. Temperature normal. Oil pressure good. But something had changed. The sound. Alongside the deep diesel hum, I now heard a sharp metallic clanking. Like something dragging along the pavement beneath the trailer. I started easing off the throttle, preparing to pull onto the shoulder and check the air lines. That's when my headlights slammed into something dark in the road ahead. Ford Bronco. It wasn't on the shoulder. It was sitting directly in the middle of my lane. No lights. No reflectors. Just a chunk of rusted metal sitting in the snow. I slammed the brakes. The tractor lurched. The trailer began to jackknife, and I felt that sickening moment of weightlessness when a multi-ton rig loses grip on the road. I turned the wheel into the slide, praying the trailer wouldn't flip. The tires screamed across the ice. The truck finally stopped at an angle, blocking both lanes. No more than 10 feet separated me from the Bronco's rear bumper. I sat there breathing hard. My heart hammered in my throat. My hands were shaking. I stared at that yellow smiley face sticker. The vehicle didn't move. No one got out. I reached under my seat and grabbed the tire iron I always kept there. Slowly, I opened the door. The freezing wind hit my face immediately, blasting snow under my jacket. I jumped down onto the asphalt. The clanking sound I had heard earlier stopped the moment I did. "Hey!" I shouted toward the Bronco. My voice disappeared in the wind. I walked around to the driver's side. The window was rolled down. I shined my flashlight inside. The interior was empty. The seats were covered with a thick layer of snow that had blown in through the open window. The ignition had been ripped out. The vehicle couldn't have been driven. It had been sitting there, abandoned, for a very long time. The engine was ice cold. Under the hood there was a small drift of snow. But on the driver's seat, resting on the fresh snow, was my work glove liner. The exact one I had lost a week earlier at a gas station in Omaha. Then suddenly, behind me, from beneath my own trailer, came that same metallic clang. Someone struck the axle with a wrench. I froze. The wind howled, but that sound was unmistakable. Someone was under my truck. Slowly, I started backing away toward the cab. I didn't look under the trailer. I didn't shine my flashlight there. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and hit the throttle. The rig straightened out with difficulty. I drove around the cursed Bronco along the shoulder, nearly sliding into the ditch. The remaining 10 miles to the truck stop I checked my mirrors every 5 seconds. I expected to see those rusted shapes again. But the highway stayed empty. I reached the truck stop, parked in the brightest area I could find, surrounded by a dozen other rigs. Only then did I finally let myself breathe. I didn't leave the cab until sunrise. I slept with the tire iron in my hands. In the morning, after the storm had calmed down, I climbed out to inspect the truck. No damage. All the air lines were intact. But when I walked to the rear axle of the trailer, cold sweat ran down my back. A thick towing cable had been tightly tied around the axle beam. On the other end dangled a heavy steel hook. That was what had been clanging along the pavement. But that wasn't the worst part. The hook was wrapped in a strip of old, faded cloth. Cloth that smelled damp and rotten. I cut the cable off with my knife, threw it in a dumpster, and drove away as fast as I could. To this day, I still don't know who, or what, kept moving that Bronco along the highway. And I never haul loads through Wyoming in the winter anymore. I used to think that was the strangest thing that could ever happen on the road. But a few years later I realized something else. Cold and isolation aren't the worst things a driver can face. What's worse is when there's nowhere to hide, and nothing around you for hundreds of miles but open land. Arizona. Interstate 10. August. During the day the temperature out there climbs to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The asphalt softens under the sun, and the air trembles with heat mirages. Most truckers prefer to cross that stretch at night. I was hauling frozen meat. Behind me the refrigeration unit droned steadily, keeping the trailer at -20 degrees. Inside the cab, the air conditioner was running full blast, but the windshield still radiated heat. It was around 2 in the morning. There was no moon. Just an endless black ribbon of asphalt stretching into the desert. No trees. No hills. Absolute emptiness. I had just passed the way station near San Simon and was heading west. The radio only picked up distant Mexican stations full of static, so I shut it off and enjoyed the silence. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. The broken white line on the highway became hypnotic. At mile 13 I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. The car was approaching very fast. I was cruising in the right lane at exactly 70 miles an hour. The vehicle caught up, moved into the left lane, and began passing me. It was a white Chevrolet Impala. An older model, early 2000s, coated in an even layer of desert dust. When it pulled alongside my cab, I instinctively glanced down. The Impala was driving parallel to me. Not passing. Not falling back. Just hanging there in the next lane. I eased off the throttle a little to let it move ahead. The Impala slowed too. I pressed the accelerator, pushing the truck up to 75. The Impala did the same. That kind of thing gets annoying. Sometimes drunk or exhausted drivers in passenger cars latch onto a semi without realizing it, using it like a guide through the darkness. I flashed my high beams to signal him. No reaction. I looked down again through the Impala's window. The glass wasn't tinted. In the dim glow of the dashboard I could see the driver. It was a man. But he wasn't looking at the road. His head was turned at an unnatural angle, almost 90 degrees to the side. He was staring directly at me. Up into the cab of the truck. His face was completely calm. No emotion at all. His hands rested on the steering wheel. The car moved perfectly straight. But he never took his eyes off me. A cold film of sweat crept down my back. I turned away, forcing myself to look straight ahead. Then I leaned on the horn. The powerful air horn shattered the silence of the desert night. The Impala suddenly accelerated hard and shot forward, disappearing into the darkness. I exhaled slowly. A junkie. Or a lunatic. The desert is full of them. I checked the refrigeration gauges, took a sip of warm water from a bottle, and tried to relax. 10 minutes passed. My nerves settled. Then suddenly I saw red taillights ahead on the shoulder. A car was parked there with its headlights off. As I got closer, my beams illuminated the white body. The same Impala. The moment I pulled alongside it, the car launched forward and swerved directly into my lane, less than 3 feet in front of my bumper. I slammed the brakes. The rig dipped heavily forward. The Impala accelerated to exactly 50 miles an hour and stayed right in front of me. I switched into the left lane to pass the bastard. The Impala instantly swerved left, blocking me. I moved back to the right. It did the same. He was playing with me. Brake checking. One of the most dangerous things anyone can do in front of a fully loaded 40-ton truck. If I couldn't stop in time, I would flatten him into the asphalt, and probably flip my own rig trying. I grabbed the CB microphone. Anyone westbound on I-10 around mile 20? Got a psycho in a white Impala blocking the road. Anybody close? Silence. Not even static. The radio was dead, even though the power light was still on. At that moment I glanced into my rearview mirror. Headlights were approaching from behind. 2 vehicles. They were driving side by side, occupying both lanes. They caught up to me and slowed down, settling about 30 feet behind my trailer. A trap. The white Impala in front of me. 2 cars behind. They had boxed me in. We were moving 40 miles an hour in the middle of an empty desert night. I couldn't accelerate. I couldn't slow down. Panic began creeping in. I had heard stories about gangs that robbed trucks on the highway or forced them to stop so they could tear open the cargo. But I was hauling frozen pork. Who the hell wants pork? I looked into my side mirror at the car behind me in the left lane. It was a dark sedan. In the glow of my trailer lights I could see the driver. His head was turned. He wasn't watching the road. He was staring upward at my trailer. Just like the driver in the Impala. They weren't trying to rob me. They wanted something else. Suddenly the refrigeration unit behind my cab shut off. The red error light flashed on my dashboard. Someone had turned it off from outside. But how? We were moving at 40 miles an hour. That's when I understood something. I couldn't stop on the highway. If I stopped, I was dead. I needed an exit. On the GPS a dirt road appeared about a mile ahead, branching off to the right. It was an old maintenance road leading to an abandoned communications tower. No lights. No pavement. I made a decision. I didn't use my turn signal. I waited until the GPS showed 100 yards to the turn. Then I jerked the wheel hard to the right. The 40-ton rig bounced onto gravel. The cab rattled violently and a cloud of pale desert dust exploded into the air. I killed the headlights completely. Left only the marker lights so I could barely see. Then I drove the truck straight into the darkness of the desert along the rough dirt track. I drove for about half a mile. Dust hung around me like a wall. Finally I hit the brakes and shut the engine off. I turned off the entire dashboard. Silence collapsed over me. Only the ticking of cooling metal from the engine. I sat there in total darkness, gripping the tire iron. Watching the mirrors. Far away on the highway there were no lights. The cars hadn't followed me. They were gone. I sat there for an hour. My heartbeat slowly returned to normal. Without the AC the heat inside the cab became unbearable, but I didn't dare start the engine again. I opened the window a couple inches to let in some air. That's when I heard it. Gravel crunching. Soft. Rhythmic. Someone was walking. Not one person. Several. The footsteps came from all around the truck. No flashlights. No voices. They simply circled the tractor slowly in the absolute darkness. I held my breath. The tire iron handle was slick with sweat. Then I heard a metallic click. The passenger door handle. Someone slowly pulled it down. The door was locked. Then another click from the trailer latch behind me. Then one more. Driver's side. Right next to my face. I could hear them breathing. Quiet. Calm. No hurry. I closed my eyes and prayed. I don't even know to whom. I sat there without moving until the eastern sky began turning gray. The footsteps had stopped an hour before sunrise. But I didn't move. When the sun finally rose over the desert, I started the engine. I switched the refrigeration unit back on. It started immediately, as if no one had touched it. I slowly drove back to the highway. At the next gas station I got out to inspect the truck. The entire rig was covered with a layer of pale desert dust. And in that dust, on every door handle, every grab bar, every latch on the trailer, there were handprints. Dozens of them. But the worst part wasn't that. On the side window, right at the level of my face, someone had written a single word in the dust. Soon. I quit that company a month later. But trucking is a disease you don't just walk away from. After a year, I was back behind the wheel again. I avoided Wyoming. I stayed clear of Arizona. I convinced myself that if I stuck to routes along the East Coast, where the population is dense and there's always traffic, I'd be safe. But evil isn't tied to geography. It's tied to you. South Carolina. Interstate 95. Late autumn. That stretch of highway cuts through swamp forests. The trees grow right up to the shoulder, and long strands of Spanish moss hang from the branches. In the glow of headlights they look like torn funeral shrouds. That night a tropical downpour was hammering the road. The rain was so heavy the water couldn't drain off the asphalt fast enough. I was hauling steel coils. One of the most dangerous loads a trucker can carry. If you slam the brakes too hard, a multi-ton coil can break its chains, punch through the trailer wall, and crush the cab, driver and all. So I drove carefully. 50 miles an hour. Smooth and steady. I passed the mile 13 sign. The radio droned on with flood warnings. The wipers squealed against the windshield. Then suddenly my headlights caught a figure on the shoulder. A man in a bright yellow raincoat. He wasn't hitchhiking. He stood with his back to the forest, facing the highway. The hood was pulled low over his head, water streaming off it in sheets. I drove past him, spraying a fan of water from my tires. Sometimes people get out of broken cars in weather like that, I thought. But there was no car anywhere nearby. 5 minutes later I saw him again. The same yellow raincoat. The same posture. Facing the road, arms hanging straight at his sides. I frowned. I had already driven nearly 5 miles. How could he be ahead of me? I told myself it was probably road maintenance workers. Maybe they were checking drainage culverts after the storm. But there were no flashing service lights ahead. 3 miles later. There he was again. This time he wasn't standing on the shoulder. He was standing directly on the white line marking the right lane. Almost in the roadway. Instinctively I steered slightly left. My hands tightened on the wheel. The rain was getting worse. I could feel the front tires beginning to lose contact with the road, hydroplaning. I eased my foot off the accelerator. The CB radio suddenly hissed. I hadn't even turned it on. From the speaker came a voice. Not static. Not interference. A clear, calm male voice. You know you can't brake. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced down at the radio. The channel display was empty. I lifted my eyes back to the road. The man in the yellow raincoat was standing directly in the center of my lane, about 50 yards ahead. I couldn't slam the brakes, the steel coils behind me would kill me. I couldn't jerk the wheel, the wet pavement would jackknife the rig and send me straight into the swamp. I had a fraction of a second to decide. I pressed the brake pedal slowly while leaning on the horn. The air horn roared through the storm. The man didn't move. He simply raised his head. In the glare of my headlights I couldn't see a face. There was only a smooth, pale surface of skin. No eyes. No nose. Just a dark hollow where a mouth should be. I squeezed my eyes shut. Impact. A dull thud struck the bumper. The truck jerked. I fought the wheel, somehow keeping the massive rig straight on the flooded asphalt. Air hissed violently from the brake cylinders. Finally I rolled to a stop on the shoulder, breathing hard. I hit him. I had hit a man. Panic crashed over me. I switched on the hazard lights. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't unclip my seatbelt on the first try. I grabbed my flashlight, opened the door, and jumped out into the pouring rain. The water soaked me instantly. I ran to the front bumper. Nothing. The bumper was intact. No dents. No blood. No scraps of fabric. I shined the flashlight under the tractor. Empty. I ran around the back, sweeping the beam across the wet asphalt behind the trailer. No body. Nothing at all. I stood there in the rain in the middle of an empty highway. The swamp around me breathed damp air. No footprints. No raincoat. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Hallucination. Exhaustion. Highway hypnosis. The jolt I felt was probably just a deep puddle. The tires hit a pocket of water. I had worked myself up over nothing. I took a deep breath and let the rain wash the cold sweat from my face. Everything's fine. Just get back in the cab. Turn on the heater. Drive to the nearest motel. I turned and walked back to the driver's door. I climbed into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Inside it was warm. I took off my soaked jacket and tossed it onto the bunk behind me. Then I turned the wipers back on. Rain pounded the windshield so hard they barely kept up, just smearing the water across the glass. I reached for the CB microphone to make sure it was switched off. And that's when I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Outside the passenger window. In that blind zone where the headlights don't reach. A face pressed against the wet glass. Pale. Distorted. Mouth open. The eyes staring straight at me. But the truck wasn't moving. And the face was slowly sliding downward across the glass, leaving a dirty smear behind. That's when I realized something. It wasn't outside. The man in the yellow raincoat had never been standing on the road. He had been inside the cab the entire time. And now he was slowly rising from the bunk behind me. I still don't know how I survived. I smashed the driver's door open with my shoulder, fell onto the asphalt, and ran down the highway in the pouring rain until a passing pickup truck finally stopped and picked me up. When the police found my rig, it was still idling on the shoulder with the door open. No one was inside. Nothing had been stolen. But on the passenger seat lay my work glove liner, soaked with melted snow from Wyoming. And on the inside of the windshield, traced through the layer of dust, was a single word. Arrived. If you were driving down an empty highway at night and saw a lone figure standing at mile 13, would you stop? I've been a long-haul truck driver for 15 years. After that much time on the road, you get used to the solitude. Your cab becomes a kind of safety capsule, sealing you off from the rest of the world. You know every sound your engine makes, every creak of the suspension. And you learn to trust your instincts. It was late January. I was hauling a load of paper from Nebraska to Salt Lake City. The stretch of Interstate 80 through Wyoming in winter is the kind of place where mistakes aren't forgiven. Wind sweeps snow off the plains and throws it across the asphalt, where it freezes into slick sheets of ice. The temperature outside hovered around -4 degrees Fahrenheit. I had already passed Evanston and was heading west. The CB radio had been silent for nearly an hour. In weather like that, the only people left on the road are professionals and lunatics. My trailer weighed close to 40 tons fully loaded, which gave me decent traction, so I kept a steady 50 miles an hour. The cab was warm. The heater hummed softly. I sipped coffee from my thermos and watched the endless white ribbon of highway glowing in the headlights. The GPS showed I was approaching mile marker 13. It was an unremarkable stretch of road surrounded by empty, snow-covered fields. No exits. No gas stations. Just open space in every direction. Up ahead on the right shoulder, I noticed a red reflector. As I got closer, my headlights pulled a silhouette out of the darkness, a car. An old sedan parked far too close to the lane. Its headlights were off. No hazard lights either. Snow had already started to pile up around it, which meant it had probably been sitting there for a couple of hours. I eased off the throttle and drifted slightly left so the wind from my rig wouldn't buffet the car. As I pulled alongside, I glanced out the passenger window. Someone was standing behind the trunk. He wasn't waving for help. Wasn't trying to get anyone's attention. He stood with his back to the road, facing the vast black field stretching out into the night. He wore a dark jacket with the hood pulled up over his head. He didn't move at all, just stood there like a statue planted in the snow. I drove past. In the side mirror I saw nothing but the cloud of powder kicked up by my wheels. My first instinct was to call highway patrol. A man could freeze to death in a night like that. I reached for the CB and switched to channel 19. Anyone out there? Got a car on the shoulder at mile 13. Looks like the driver might need help. Only static answered. I repeated the message. Nothing but the crackle of interference. In that part of Wyoming, signals disappear all the time because of the terrain, so I figured I'd call it in once I picked up a cell signal. I drove another 10 miles. The road began to climb. The engine strained and growled as I shifted down. Snow thickened, cutting visibility to maybe 100 yards. And that's when I saw it again. On the shoulder. The same sedan. I recognized it instantly from the dent in the rear left fender I'd noticed earlier. It was parked the same way, too close to the lane. Headlights off. I frowned. I hadn't stopped. I'd been rolling at 50 miles an hour the whole time. For that car to get ahead of me, it would have had to pass me in the opposite lane without headlights in the middle of a blizzard. There was no way I wouldn't have seen it in my mirrors. But there it was. Ahead of me. I slowed again. As I pulled alongside, I looked out the window. The man was still standing behind the trunk. Back to the road. Facing the darkness. A chill crept down my spine. My brain scrambled for a logical explanation. Another car of the same model? A coincidence? Two broken-down sedans with identical dents sitting 10 miles apart. I pressed the accelerator. I wanted to get away from that stretch of road as fast as possible. The engine roared as the truck gathered speed. That was when the CB radio came to life. At first it was just noise. Then, through the static, a sound pushed its way through. Not a voice. Breathing. Heavy. Rhythmic. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Who's on the channel? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The breathing didn't stop. It grew louder, as if someone had pressed the microphone right against their lips. Then came a quiet, monotonous knocking. Tap. 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 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. I switched the CB off. The click of the toggle sounded deafening. The cab fell silent again except for the low rumble of the engine and the soft hum of the heater. I told myself it was just some idiot pulling a prank. Truckers sometimes mess around like that during night shifts. Another 20 minutes passed. The snowfall had turned into a full-blown storm. The wipers struggled to keep up. My eyes burned from the strain of watching the road. Then I saw a sign ahead, rest area, 1 mile. It wasn't much, just a paved turnout for trucks. No bathrooms, no vending machines. Just a place to wait out bad weather. I decided to pull in for 10 minutes. Check the trailer straps. Knock the ice off the wipers. Clear my head. The lot was completely empty. Not a single truck. Only a smooth layer of untouched snow under the yellow glow of a lone lamp. I parked in the middle of the lot but left the engine running. Pulled on my jacket, grabbed my heavy flashlight, and opened the door. The cold hit me like a slap across the face. I jumped down into the snow and walked around the front of the tractor, knocking ice off the wipers. Then I headed toward the trailer. Snow crunched under my boots. I checked the seal on the rear doors, still intact. Everything looked fine. As I walked back along the passenger side of the truck, I stopped. Over the rumble of my diesel engine, I heard another sound. Snow crunching. Footsteps. Someone was walking on the other side of my truck. The steps were steady. Unhurried. I switched off my flashlight. Instinct told me to disappear. I pressed my back against the cold metal of the trailer. The footsteps moved toward the front of the rig. Someone was circling my truck. Slowly, I leaned out from behind the corner of the trailer. Under the dim light of the rest area lamp, I saw a figure. Dark jacket. Hood pulled up. The same man. He stood beside the driver's door of my cab. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it was vibrating in my throat. How had he gotten here? I hadn't seen headlights. Hadn't heard an engine. The lot had been empty. The man raised his hand. For a second I thought he might be holding a weapon. But he simply placed his palm against the glass of my driver's window. In the yellow light I saw his hand clearly. It was 20 degrees below freezing. But he wasn't wearing a glove. The skin was unnaturally pale. Smooth. No sign of frostbite. Slowly, he dragged his palm across the glass, leaving a long smeared mark. Then he turned his head toward me. The hood completely hid his face. There was nothing inside it but darkness. He knew I was standing behind the trailer. The man lowered his hand and took a step toward me. I didn't wait. I sprinted to the passenger door, climbed the steps in 2 strides, yanked it open, and threw myself into the cab. I hit the lock before I was even fully inside. Then I scrambled over into the driver's seat, kicked off the parking brake, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The wheel spun on the snow for a second before the rig lurched forward and crawled back onto the highway. I didn't check the mirrors. I drove as fast as the icy road would allow. Only at dawn, when the eastern sky began to turn gray, did I finally let myself breathe again. I reached a large truck stop outside Salt Lake City. There were people everywhere, engines idling, diesel fumes in the air, the smell of coffee drifting from the diner. Normal life. I climbed down from the cab to inspect the truck. When I reached the driver's door, I froze. The smear from the man's palm was still on the glass. But that wasn't the worst part. Below the mark, traced through the layer of road salt and grime, someone had written a series of numbers with a finger. It was my home phone number. The same number that wasn't listed on any shipping paperwork. The number only my wife knew. I wiped the numbers away with my sleeve. But the cold on my skin stayed with me forever. I thought the worst was behind me. But a few years later I realized something about highways. Some roads seem to be connected, as if tied together by a single invisible thread. It was August. The heat in Arizona was so intense the asphalt still felt like it was melting even at night. I was running east along Interstate 10, hauling a load from Los Angeles to Phoenix. Aircraft engine parts. Expensive cargo, tight delivery window. It was close to 2 in the morning. I had just crossed the state line and was moving through a lonely desert stretch near Ehrenberg. The air conditioner in the cab was working at full blast, but the air still felt heavy and sticky. I sipped warm cola from a bottle and stared at the hypnotic white dashed lines rolling beneath my headlights. Night in the desert is pure darkness. Your headlights only carve out a narrow tunnel of visibility, just a strip of asphalt and a dusty shoulder lined with dry scrub. My GPS beeped. Mile marker 13 was coming up. I glanced at my left mirror. Far behind me, 2 small points of light appeared. Someone was closing the distance fast. I was cruising in the right lane at 70 miles an hour with the cruise control on. The headlights were approaching too quickly. Within a minute the car was directly behind my trailer. But the driver didn't pass. Instead, he glued himself to my bumper. The distance couldn't have been more than a few feet. In the mirror I could see nothing but the blinding glare of his headlights reflecting off the polished metal doors of my trailer. Every trucker hates that. If I had to brake suddenly because of a coyote or a shredded tire lying in the road, that car would end up buried under my rear bumper. I tapped the brake pedal twice, just enough to flash my brake lights. Standard signal. Back off. The driver didn't react. He stayed right there. I switched off cruise control and eased my speed down to 60. If he was in a hurry, he could go around. The left lane was completely open. But he slowed down too. Perfectly matching my speed. I felt irritation creeping in. I grabbed the CB microphone. "Hey, car behind me. You've got a whole lane open. Pass me or back off. Your headlights are blinding me." Silence. I pushed the truck back up to 75. He accelerated with me. At that point it stopped feeling like stupidity. It started to feel deliberate. I decided to try an old trick. I turned on my right blinker as if I were about to pull onto the shoulder and started drifting toward the rumble strip. The moment my right tires touched it, the headlights behind me suddenly went out. Instantly. Just like someone flipped a switch. Complete darkness. I jerked the wheel back into my lane and stared into the mirrors. Nothing. Just the ink-black desert behind me. I waited. 1 minute. 2. Nobody passed me. That meant the driver had either pulled onto the shoulder, or turned off into the desert. But there were no exits. Then I felt the bump. Soft. Almost gentle. Like someone had lightly nudged my 40-ton truck from behind. The vibration traveled through the entire chassis and into the steering wheel. He was still there. Driving inches from my bumper. With his headlights turned off. At 70 miles an hour. In total darkness. Cold sweat formed on my forehead. This wasn't some drunk kid messing around. Pulling something like that required perfect timing and nerves of ice. I grabbed the CB again. "Anyone alive out here on I-10? I've got a situation. Somebody's playing games around mile 13. Come back." For about 10 seconds the speaker held nothing but static. Then a voice came through. It was crystal clear. No interference. Male. Calm. Completely emotionless. It sounded like someone reading from a script. "Reduce your speed. We need to inspect the cargo." I froze. Truckers don't talk like that. Neither do cops. "Who is this?" I asked. "Identify yourself." "Reduce your speed," the same flat voice repeated. "Open the trailer doors. We'll finish quickly." Was this some kind of highway robbery attempt? I'd seen stuff like that in action movies. But in real life? In Arizona? I looked into the mirror. And that's when something appeared to my left. A vehicle emerged from the darkness and started passing me. Black SUV. Its headlights were still off. It pulled up alongside my cab. I looked down through the driver's window. The passenger window of the SUV was rolled down. A man was leaning halfway out of it. He wore a tight black mask over his face. In his hands he held a massive industrial flashlight. Then he switched it on. The beam hit me straight in the eyes. For a split second I was completely blind. Instinctively I slammed the brakes and jerked the wheel to the right. The tractor fishtailed, and the trailer leaned dangerously. I fought the steering wheel while hearing the shriek of tires and smelling burning rubber. The truck skidded onto the shoulder, throwing up a cloud of dust, and came to a stop barely a few feet from a deep drainage ditch. I sat there breathing hard, gripping the wheel. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The SUV didn't stop. It just disappeared into the darkness ahead. Its brake lights never came on. I stayed in the cab for 10 minutes with the engine running, expecting them to come back. But the highway remained empty. Finally I put the truck back in gear and crawled at low speed until I reached the nearest truck stop in Tonopah. Under the bright floodlights of the fuel station, I climbed down to inspect the truck. I expected to find dents in my rear bumper. But the bumper was untouched. I walked to the back of the trailer. The lock was still there. But threaded through the metal latch that held the doors shut was a thick plastic zip tie. Bright red. Heavy duty. The kind used on construction sites. They hadn't been trying to break into the trailer while I was moving. They hadn't been trying to rob me. The SUV had distracted me while someone, probably lying on the hood of another car driving inches from my bumper with its headlights off, attached that marker. They had marked my truck. In total darkness. At 70 miles an hour. I cut the zip tie off with my knife and threw it in a trash can. The rest of the way to Phoenix, I never took my eyes off the mirrors. And I never again accepted night runs through that stretch of highway. But the worst thing about this job is that sometimes you don't get to choose your route. Sometimes the route chooses you. It was late fall. I was hauling a refrigerated trailer along Interstate 95 through South Carolina. That stretch of road is isolated. The highway cuts through swamps and dense pine forests. The smell of rotting leaves and stagnant water seeps into the cab even when the windows are closed. That night a thick fog rolled in. It seemed to spill out of the swamps, curling low across the asphalt. Visibility was terrible. I was moving at no more than 40 miles an hour. Behind me, the refrigeration unit droned steadily, keeping the trailer at sub-zero temperature. That sound becomes like white noise after a while. Eventually you stop noticing it, but it swallows every other sound around you. I passed the sign marking mile 13. A dark shape suddenly emerged from the fog directly in the center of my lane. At first I thought it was an alligator, what truckers call the shredded remains of a blown tire. But when my headlights fully illuminated the object, I realized what it was. Traffic cones. 3 of them. They were placed in a perfect line across the right lane. I steered left and changed lanes. The cones disappeared behind me. Strange. There were no construction vehicles. No flashing lights. Just cones sitting in the middle of an empty highway. I moved back into the right lane and drove another mile. Then a sign appeared through the fog. It was an ordinary orange diamond construction sign. But instead of standing on a proper metal stand, it was leaning crookedly against a wooden post. Someone had scrawled a message across it in black paint. Detour, exit in 500 feet. An arrow pointed toward a narrow dirt road that disappeared straight into the forest. My GPS said nothing. There were no official warnings about any detours. I kept driving. A moment later, there was a sound like a gunshot. The bang was so violent the tractor jerked hard to the right. The steering wheel tried to rip itself out of my hands. My front right tire had blown. I gripped the wheel and fought to keep the truck on the pavement. Rubber slapped and tore apart as it shredded itself to pieces. The rim scraped along the asphalt, throwing bright sparks into the fog. I managed to bring the truck to a stop on the narrow shoulder. Beyond the shoulder the ground dropped sharply into black swamp water. I cursed under my breath and shut off the engine. With the tractor silent, the hum of the refrigeration unit behind me suddenly sounded deafening. Changing a tire in thick fog on an unlit highway is practically suicide. But I didn't have a choice. If I stayed there until morning, the first exhausted driver who drifted off would plow straight into me. I grabbed my heavy flashlight, pulled on a reflective vest, and took a steel pry bar from the cab. Just in case. When I opened the door, the smell of swamp water hit me immediately. The night was unnaturally quiet except for the roar of the refrigeration system. I walked to the front right wheel. The tire was completely destroyed. I crouched down and shined the flashlight across the torn rubber. That's when I saw it. Something metallic was embedded in the tire. It wasn't a nail. It wasn't a piece of scrap metal. It was a tetrahedron welded from steel rods. A caltrop. A spike designed to puncture vehicle tires no matter how it lands. One sharp point always faces upward. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had placed the cones to force me into the left lane. Then they must have removed them so I would return to the right lane, straight onto the spikes. They wanted me to take that dirt road. And when I didn't, they blew out my tire instead. I froze. A cold stiffness spread through my muscles. Slowly, I stood up and pointed my flashlight down the slope toward the swamp. Fog drifted above the black water. In the beam of light I saw a reed swaying. Then I heard a sound. Splash. Splash. Someone was walking through the water. Slowly. Heavily. The sound was coming from below, at the base of the embankment. And it was getting closer. I stepped backward. The refrigeration unit was loud, but that wet, sucking sound of footsteps through mud cut straight through the noise. I turned and ran for the cab. I climbed the steps in 2 strides, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. And that's when I found myself in the exact situation I described at the beginning of this story. I sat in the driver's seat, barely breathing. A light drizzle had begun, turning the fog into a sticky gray mist. The engine was still off. Behind me the refrigeration unit vibrated steadily. The man climbed the embankment. I couldn't see his face. Just a dark, wet silhouette. He walked up to the passenger door. He didn't pound on the metal. He didn't try to break the glass. He knew the noise from the refrigeration unit would hide most sounds anyway. Slowly, he tested the door handle. Click. Then he pulled out a thin tool. I recognized it immediately. A slim steel lockout tool used to open car doors. He slid it down between the window and the rubber seal. I was sitting less than 3 feet away from him. My hand gripped the pry bar tightly, but I understood something. If I opened the door to attack him, I would lose the advantage of being inside the cab. The tool scraped softly against the lock mechanism inside the door. He worked calmly. Methodically. Like a professional. My eyes drifted to the ignition key. The tire was destroyed. The rim was bent. But the engine still worked. I turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life. The man outside didn't even flinch. He kept working the tool inside the door. I threw the truck into gear, released the parking brake, and slammed the accelerator down. The truck lurched forward. The sound of bare metal grinding against asphalt was horrifying. The tractor leaned heavily to the right. The steering wheel fought me the entire time, but the truck was moving. I knocked the man off the step as I accelerated. I never looked in the mirror. I drove 15 miles on the naked rim. Sparks flew everywhere. I didn't stop until I saw the bright lights of a highway way station. Police arrived quickly. They inspected the ruined tire and took the caltrop as evidence. Then they drove out to mile 13 to check the area. They found nothing. No cones. No detour sign. No tracks along the shoulder. The rain had washed everything away. The officer looked at me with sympathy, but I could see doubt in his eyes. "Maybe you just ran over some road debris, sir." I didn't argue. I quit the job a month later. But that story stayed with me for another reason. Not long ago I was thinking back to that moment inside the cab. The man at the door. The scraping sound of metal. And I realized something that still makes it hard for me to breathe. The tool he slid into the door. He wasn't moving it up and down to hook the lock rod. He was moving it side to side. He wasn't trying to open my door. He was pushing something inside the panel. Something small. Something meant to stay with me after I drove away. A tracker? A marker? I sold that truck many years ago. But sometimes I lie awake at night thinking about the man who drives it now. If you were in my place, would you have stopped to check the tire?